So welcome to the Classic Strand of Lectures at this year's Academy. I'm Jeff Kidder, Membership and Events Director at the Institute of Ideas. Over the next couple of days, we'll be looking at the theme of morality in the plays of Euripides, Plato's Symposium, and the Aeneid. But today we're starting with Might and Right in Thucydides. And we're very pleased to have with us Professor Neville Morley, who's Professor of Ancient History at the University of Bristol. Professor Morley was awarded both an MA and PhD in Cambridge before moving to Bristol, where he currently teaches. And he has three main research interests: the economic, social and ecological history of classical antiquity, the reception of antiquity in 18th and 19th century economic and social thought, and the theoretical and philosophical approaches to historiography. For the past 4 years, Professor Morley has been leading a research project funded by the AHRC titled Thucydides, Reception, Reinterpretation and Influence. He's currently working on a book on Karl Marx for the OUP Classics and Theory series, as well as articles on approaches to studying ancient economy. So welcome, Neville, and off you go.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Right, I'm going to be focusing this lecture on the passage in Thucydides' history known as the Melian Dialogue. I have a vague hope that everyone might at least have glanced at this, if not have any more sort of expert knowledge of this period. I should say this is all quite loosely organised, so if there is something which is absolutely not clear, I do feel free to interrupt me. But obviously, you know, the main focus is that there's lots of time left at the end for discussion. Right, I'll start off, as I say, I hope you have all looked at the Melian Dialogue. I'm going to start off by setting the scene and giving a very, very brief summary, just to emphasise the essential points, and draw out what can be considered, you know, the major moral issues which Thucydides raises in this passage. So, historical setting, we're in 416 BCE, which is the 16th year of what's now known as the Peloponnesian War, what Thucydides himself describes as the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. I checked this earlier, I can see that, you know, from the back this is not the most easily sort of viewed map, but can't see it properly. Here is Athens, here is Sparta, this is the Peloponnese, which is not entirely dominated by the Spartans and their allies, but largely dominated by it. Athens, meanwhile, is above all a naval power. One of the reasons why this war drags on for quite so long, 30 years, is because, in many respects, this is the war of the irresistible force against the immovable object, or rather, it's the war of the greatest land power in Greece, the Spartans, against the great naval power, the Athenians. And they spend much of the war, I suppose you'd almost say, not fighting one another, fighting proxy battles in other regions. And the Spartans regularly invade Athenian territory, the Athenians withdraw into their city, kind of nothing happens, the Spartans withdraw again, the Athenians come out again. Various military expeditions, mainly up in the northern regions, and meanwhile the Athenians are doing their utmost to extend their domination of the sea. Those of the very many islands in the Aegean that are not already their allies, or scare quotes allies, you could equally term them subjects of the Athenian Empire. So, you know, those Aegean islands that are not already on the Athenian side come under significant pressure to change sides. And that's what we have with Milos. I mean, one of the reasons Thucydides discusses events in Milos is not that they were themselves especially important, but this stands as an example. It's, you could say, almost a case study of, at least in Thucydides' view, the behaviour of the Athenians at this stage in the war. So, Milos is an independent state. It's, and again, if you know Greek history, you'll have come across the term polis. little independent city-state. We don't know its population, but it's unlikely to have been more than a couple of thousand. And basically Greece is made up of hundreds of these little independent, semi-independent states. Milos was originally a Spartan colony. It's got a long history of friendship with Sparta. The Athenians turn up, along with various of their allies, a fairly substantial military expedition. According to Thucydides, 38 ships, about 2,500 hoplites, plus various sort of lighter troops armed with bows and arrows. They turn up and issue their demands. And this is the Melian dialogue. The Athenians, having landed on Milos, send a small group to present their demands to the Melians. The Melians, or the leaders of the Melians, insist on this being held in private rather than allowing the Athenians to address the assembly. The basic Athenian demand: surrender or else. But what's striking from the very beginning of the dialogue is how far the Athenians go out of their way to strip out any sort of rhetoric, to remove the usual sorts of language, the usual sorts of claims that are made in this sort of ultimatum, and to say, we're just going to talk about the facts on the ground. And I should say, you're not going to recognise, or you're not likely to recognise, this rendition of the dialogue. This is not an exact translation. It's rather it's a version intended to draw out some of the essential ideas and, I suppose, polemically put them into a fairly sort of modernised version. So don't take these as really exactly the words of Thucydides, but these are the key ideas. The Athenians open by saying, forget about all the usual nonsense. We're not going to claim that we have any sort of right to conquer you because we fought off the Persians. We're not going to make any reference to our history of defending Greek civilization. And you can forget about any nonsense of claiming that, we've never done you any harm. What we're going to talk about is how things actually are at the moment. We're going to go down to brass tacks. We're going to talk about the realities of power. And this includes excluding any discussion of right or wrong, morality, justice, ethics, or anything else. And this is one of the key claims the Athenians make. Arguments about justice actually are relevant only if you're dealing with two powers who have equal power. If you're dealing with international equals, states that are on the same level, or individuals that are on the same level, then you can discuss justice. But if you're talking about a disparity, if you're talking about an Athenian superpower against Milos, then actually justice is kind of irrelevant. Or rather, justice is the strong are going to do what they like, and the weak have to put up with it. And this is the famous line from the Melian dialogue. It comes up in different versions. The famous one, the one that's most often quoted, is that produced by Richard Crawley in the 19th century, which is that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It's often the case with Crawley's translation. It's very memorable. He coins a good aphorism. It's not the most accurate translation of the Greek. Rather better is to say something like, the possibilities are defined by what the strong do and what the weak accept. Or, as I've suggested here, reality is defined by what the strong do and what the weak accept. But this is the sort of, in its different versions, the crucial statement of might is right. The idea that justice is irrelevant, what matters is power, strength, the ability to do things. At which point then the Athenians move into their sort of pragmatic, let's just talk about the reality of things argument, which is to say, our concern is the security of our empire, therefore we need to conquer you. but actually this will be to your benefit as well. Why will this be to the Melians' benefit? Because they're not going to get slaughtered. Whereas if they fight, they will lose everything. So again, what the Athenians aim to do is exclude any consideration of morality, and simply to say that, whether or not it's right, we have the power to destroy you. It suits us to do so unless you submit. The Melians try various arguments to find a compromise position. So, for example, why can't they remain neutral? They're not going to harm the Athenians, they won't side with the Spartans, why can't they just be left alone? At which point the Athenians then explain that actually the Melians are not in themselves any sort of threat, but rather, if the Athenians don't crush the Melians, that will be taken as a sign of weakness. This is not actually about Athenian strategy or Athenian advantage, so much as Athenian relations with their own subjects, with their allies, the other members of the Athenian Empire. If they see that the Athenians are weak, they might rebel. Whereas if Athens crushes the Melians, that's going to show that they're strong. Their allies are going to think twice before trying anything else, trying any sort of rebellion. The Melians suggest that, isn't this a problem? If every neutral power thinks that they might be at risk of Athenian attack, they're going to side with the Spartans automatically, to which the Athenian answer is, well, that might happen, but actually we're not too bothered about that. As far as we're concerned, what matters is dealing with islands like yours, making sure that we control them. The Melians try another tack to say, well, fortune is a bit unpredictable. Who knows? You launch your attack on us, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. If we surrender now, we've lost. Whereas if we fight, we might stand a chance. We have still some hope. To which we get another of the classic lines from the Melian dialogue: hope, danger's comforter. Hope as an illusion. Hope as a way of trying to ignore the reality of things. So as far as the Athenians are concerned, the Melians don't have any real grounds for hope. They would simply be deluding themselves and essentially leading themselves into disaster. The Melians, obviously these are doing extracts here, the Melians then put forward the case that they have trust in two things. Firstly, that the gods will be on their side because they have justice on their side, and secondly, they'll trust in the friendship of the Spartans to come and help them. Which the Athenian answer is, well, I really wouldn't trust in the Spartans if I were you. They have a very, very strong sense of their own self-interest, and why should they put themselves out for you lot? Secondly, why should the gods be on the Melian side? And this is a sort of a development of the Athenians' earlier claim that the reality of things is the power of the strong. Here the suggestion is that it's a law of nature, that whenever someone has the upper hand, they take advantage of it. It's not just them. They happen to have the power at this point. They're following the examples of earlier history, and they're quite sure that at some point their power will decline, another power will rise, and that power will do exactly the same thing. So, that's the basic line of the Melian dialogue. And the conclusion the Melians eventually reach is they're going to try fighting anyway. Their basic argument is, well, certain slavery is worse than possible death. They go back to their hope that if they surrender immediately, they've certainly lost. If they fight, maybe the gods will be on their side, maybe the Spartans will come and help them, maybe whatever. Now, the way I want to approach thinking about this passage and sort of how we might sort of interpret the ideas, how we might make sense of what Thucydides is trying to do here, is to look at different traditions of reading and interpreting Thucydides. In other words, start off by looking at the different ways in which this passage has been understood by different readers. The executive summary: Thucydides has been understood in quite different ways by different people. There's a certain tendency to think of him as a historian, but that's not the only way of understanding his work or understanding its significance. And even if he is labelled a historian, there's then quite a lot of scope for argument about what that actually means. And in fact, the different sort of ideas of Thucydides, certainly over the last 500–600 years, are frequently sort of downright contradictory. And certainly it's quite difficult to square some of them with what Thucydides actually writes. It's been one of the big questions for my research over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. How do we get so many different Thucydideses, and I haven't had a better term for it than that, given that it's the same text, why is it that readers discover quite different writers, have quite different conceptions of what this work is all about? The one thing that they have in common is the belief in Thucydides as an authority, as a writer who is important, as a writer whose work has something important to teach us. But what that might be is, disputed more or less endlessly. The first thing, obviously, is Thucydides the historian. And in antiquity, but particularly from the 16th century onwards, Thucydides has been seen as the founder of true history, as the perfect historian, as the model for present-day historiography. So not just someone who's there at the very invention of history as we would understand it, but someone who actually almost perfected it at the beginning, even if his successors then failed to learn the right lessons. And Thucydides is seen to be a sort of perfect historian in all sorts of different ways, partly, of course, depending on what the reader thought the ideal historian would be. They then discover that Thucydides fits that pattern. So, there's Thucydides' own experience, the fact that he himself had fought in the war, the fact that he had at least some experience in Athenian politics, means that he knows what he's talking about. And for readers of the 16th, 17th century, that was important. The sense that the historian should not be a scholar sitting in a library writing about things that he doesn't actually properly understand. The historian needs to be someone who actually knows what it's like to fight in battle, what it's like to make a speech in front of the assembly, and so forth. So, Thucydides ticks those boxes. However, when the pattern changes, we come into the 18th century, there's more and more emphasis on the historian as scholar, the historian as critic, the historian as someone who carefully works through all of the sources and so forth. Then actually Thucydides is right there, ready to be read in those terms. In particular, there are these passages from his first book, sections sort of 20 to 23, where Thucydides offers what might be termed his methodological precepts. He explains how he's gone about composing his history. He explains why this is a better history than anything else anyone else is writing at the time. It's the most sort of thoroughly self-aggrandizing methodological statement you're likely to come across. All of this fits with a sort of 18th, 19th century conception of the role of the critical historian. So Thucydides here is emphasizing the need for the scrutiny of evidence, the fact that we can't accept all of the stories that are handed down about the past, that people have all sorts of misconceptions and sort of foolish ideas and so forth. What you need is the critical historian to weigh up the different accounts and decide what's plausible and what isn't. Thucydides has this skeptical attitude to myths and traditions. He doesn't take Homer as a historical source. He takes Homer as a poet who happened to convey some historical information. He doesn't accept myth until it's been subjected to his own critical analysis. And he emphasizes uncertainty. He's realistic about whether or not we can fully know the past, whether or not we can have a completely full and accurate picture. So all of these passages, emphasize this sort of idea. Thucydides as the critical historian, rejecting fable, rejecting the idea that history is a literary art, that it's about writing something entertaining. No, Thucydides goes to the opposite extreme. Thucydides is sort of a forerunner in the idea that you show you're a serious historian by being really boring and excluding any sort of entertaining aspect, which again perfectly fits in with 18th, 19th century conceptions of what history is all about. It's no longer history as rhetoric or history as art, it's history as science. And that's what Thucydides is set up as. A classic example here from, I would say, still one of the best books ever written on Thucydides as a historian, Wilhelm Roscher, who later became a sort of noted political economist, to the extent that Karl Marx used to refer to him disparagingly as the Thucydides of political economy. But his first major published work is a really interesting account of Thucydides as a historian, which sets up Thucydides as the modern historian before modernity, as someone who has managed to anticipate modern scientific critical history several thousand years before anyone else had thought of it. Roscher even says that he and his contemporaries have still not got as far as Thucydides in producing a truly critical scientific history. So, that's one model. Particularly up until the end of the 19th century, this is the dominant way in which Thucydides was understood. The perfect critical historian whose account can be taken pretty well at face value. But there are some obvious problems with that. And if we accept that picture, we then have to say, well, the Melian dialogue gives us a completely reliable account of what the Athenians said to the Melians, what the Melians said to the Athenians. So we can take that as straightforward historical evidence for this episode of history, and we can draw more general conclusions about Greek attitudes towards justice, Greek ideas of relation between states, and so forth. But there are some obvious problems with this, and actually the Melian dialogue is one of the passages in Thucydides' history which instantly raises questions about the idea that he's a modern historian. I mean, quite simply, modern historians do not fill their histories with made-up speeches. And the Melian dialogue is probably the most extreme example because it's presented as a dialogue. It looks more like the script of a Greek tragedy. You've got the two speakers offering arguments against one another. Most of Thucydides' speeches are much longer. The speaker has, sort of set at least several chapters to develop his ideas. Sometimes there is then an answering speech from an opponent. Sometimes there isn't. The Melian dialogue doesn't even look like the other speeches in Thucydides' history. It's even harder to believe that it could be an accurate transcription of what was actually said. And on top of that, recall that this meeting between the Melians and the Athenians was in secret. Thucydides was not there, sitting in the corner scribbling notes. With some of his other speeches, it's possible to believe that he was. The famous speech given by Pericles, known as the funeral oration, at the end of the first year of the war. Now there, Thucydides was, as far as we know, in Athens. He certainly could have been in Athens, he could have heard the speech, he could certainly have talked to a whole load of people who did hear the speech. We can have at least some confidence that it's not completely made up. But with the Melian dialogue, we don't have that sort of confidence. And even in fact, what Thucydides says himself about his speeches ought to ring alarm bells. And basically he says, we're back in the methodological section of Book 1, as to what was said in speeches, it was difficult for me to recall the precise details, even if I was there, let alone if other people reported back to me. What I have done is set down how I think each of the speakers would have expressed what was most appropriate in the particular circumstances. In other words, Thucydides is telling us that he's making this up. This is not a transcription, it is his sense of what the speaker ought to have said, sort of modified or qualified by any evidence he happens to have of what was actually said. So, with a Melian dialogue, we have to say this cannot possibly be what was actually said. And for many commentators on Thucydides, this is a major problem. How can he be this perfect historian if he's actually happy to invent things? It's a sort of phrase, you know, sort of the judgment produced by someone like Lord Macaulay, that the speeches of Thucydides have something of the grotesque character of Chinese pleasure grounds in which perpendicular rocks of granite stand up in the midst of a soft green plain. Now, Macaulay was clearly not keen on Chinese horticulture. But I think, you know, what this conveys is the sense of incongruity. How can you have this fantastically critical, accurate, truth-obsessed history with a load of fictional speeches in it? And if you want to believe in Thucydides as the ideal historian, that's a bit of a problem. Some historians, some readers of Thucydides, have nevertheless tried to carry on believing it. And the great Donald Kagan, you know, one of the sort of, you know, most important, most influential modern scholars of Thucydides, still maintains that the speeches are basically accurate. I'm not quite sure how he can maintain this, but he does. Other readers of Thucydides have come up with more ingenious explanations, and it becomes a way of moving away from the idea of the historian as someone who is simply a chronicler of facts, to the idea of a historian as someone who's interested in interpretation, in understanding, and in bringing the past to life. So, readings of Thucydides that would say, the speeches are not there to tell us what was actually said, the speeches are Thucydides' means of giving us understanding into the situation. They are means of bringing the past to life, of putting the reader right in the middle of events, of dramatising it, and so forth. It's a reminder that historiography is a literary art. It's not solely a literary art, but it is literary. You can't remove the rhetoric and the artfulness from history. Arguably, you shouldn't even try. And that's the sentiment of someone like Arnold J. Toynbee in his comments. Toynbee's basically saying that the problem here is not Thucydides, it's the modern historian who thinks you can get rid of the rhetoric, who thinks you can get rid of the art. Actually, modern history is still rhetorical, it's still artful. It just follows different conventions so that we don't see this. We don't necessarily recognise how far modern historians are using all sorts of literary techniques and tricks to persuade the reader of the accuracy of their accounts. We can see Thucydides doing this because he uses different conventions. So there are all sorts of debates that can be had about, you know, does this mean, does the Melian dialogue mean we should dismiss Thucydides as a historian, or does it mean we should expand our view of what history is all about? But certainly, as far as the Melian dialogue is concerned, it means we've got to have a slightly more sophisticated approach. We can't simply take this as an accurate account of what was said. We can't take it as at face value as a reliable account of what the Athenians thought or what the Greeks thought about justice and ethics in international relations. So, that's the first tradition, Thucydides as historian. The second great tradition is Thucydides as a kind of political theorist. This has been the dominant tradition over the last century. It stretches back further. It certainly goes back to Thomas Hobbes, who produced the first proper English translation of Thucydides back in 1629. Hobbes was enormously influenced by Thucydides' work. It's found in the 15th and 16th century in various Italian political theorists, even a little bit of Machiavelli. So, there is a tradition of seeing Thucydides not as a historian at all, but as someone who is basically interested in the nature of politics, the nature of human behaviour. And this, one of the main reasons for this reading is found, again, we go back into the methodological chapter in the beginning of Thucydides' first book, and the claim he makes about the usefulness of his history. So, oops, wrong button. This passage here. History will be useful if it's judged useful by those who want to have a clear view of what happened in the past, and what, the human condition being what it is, can be expected to happen again sometime in the future in similar or much the same ways. Why is it useful to study the Peloponnesian War? Because this is going to help us understand things more generally. It's not the past as an end in itself, it's the past as a guide to the present, as a guide to the future, founded on this notion that things tend to repeat themselves more or less. And that idea is founded on what is translated in this passage as the human condition being what it is. Now, this is one of these tricky bits of translating Thucydides, where he uses a single, very gnomic phrase, and we have to wonder what he actually means by it. The phrase in this case in the Greek is kata to anthropion, which, the best literal translation would be according to the human thing. How you translate that in rather better English rather depends on what you think he means by it. So, at one end, you've got a sort of fuzzy, well, people being what they are, or, the human condition being what it is, then events tend to repeat themselves. At the other end of the spectrum, you can translate it as something in a much stronger way as because of human nature. In other words, positing a universal human nature that therefore means events tend to play out again and again in basically the same way, and by studying the past, you can therefore identify the underlying principles, the regularities, the laws of human society. And that is the basic approach that grounds a sort of a political scientific reading of Thucydides. His work is understood to be not chronicling the past as an end in itself, but gathering historical data in order to develop general theories of human behaviour. In other words, we can look to Thucydides for some general principles that will be more widely applicable. And this has been used above all in international relations theory, above all in the United States, and above all since the Second World War, in particular in the school of thought known as realism. And you've got a quote here from one of the most important realist thinkers one of the most important of the current generation of realist thinkers, Robert Gilpin, basically setting out this principle. Thucydides is the first to identify fundamental principles of international relations. Men and state are motivated by honour, greed and fear. This is therefore what governs relations between states in all areas at all periods. And the Melian dialogue is the central text for this line of thinking. And basically, at least kind of a crude realist interpretation, takes the Melian dialogue as Thucydides' fundamental statement of the nature of international relations. The world order is basically anarchic. There is no international legal system. There is no shared system of justice or ethics. There is only power. There is only the differential between how much power different states have, and there are these consistent motivations which then govern how states behave within this system. And quite simply, that is a crude but pretty well complete account of realist, neo-realist international relations theory. Thucydides is honoured as being the first person to have kind of spotted that this is the nature of the world. He is therefore read as the person who did this, and of course, offers a noble intellectual pedigree for realist theory. And there's a classic phrase which, if you read international relations literature, you will come across again and again, ever since the days of Thucydides. I now know actually of at least 2 journal articles which have taken this as their title on the basis that it is such a cliché of the discipline. The idea that this is the nature of the world and that Thucydides identified it has been, as I say, if not dominant, then certainly pervasive in American political thought since the Second World War. It has the advantage of being extremely adaptable. The 1950s into the 1960s, this showed that Thucydides was the perfect text for understanding the Cold War. And you've got the 2 great power blocks. You've got Athens versus Sparta, massive land power versus highly mobile sort of naval power, different ideological systems. Perfectly obvious that Thucydides is describing the Cold War. Though it has to be said, various American writers, they're never quite sure whether they wanted to identify Athens or Sparta. Mostly Athens, because that's democracy and freedom, and you want to be able to quote all the wonderful bits in the funeral oration. On the other hand, the Athenians lost, and in various respects, some American thinkers did think that they looked more like Sparta. But anyway, general agreement. Thucydides tells you all about the Cold War. Post-1989, rather than disappearing from the curriculum completely, it's then simply asserted Thucydides is exactly the text for understanding international anarchy when there is no longer a nice bipolar system. Because actually, if you read Thucydides' account, it's not just about Athens and Sparta, it's about all of the different powers. It's the extent to which Sparta gets dragged into war because one of its allies gets into a fight with one of the Athenian allies. So actually, you read Thucydides differently, he remains current, as long as you have this belief that Thucydides tells you something important. And the latest version of this, I don't know if anyone's come across the idea of the Thucydides trap. If you read anything about sort of ideas on US-China relations, there's a political theorist in Harvard who has been popularizing the notion of the Thucydides trap, the idea that in the Peloponnesian War, the basic dynamic was Sparta became afraid of the rise of Athens, so war was inevitable. And that's a sort of version of what Thucydides says. America is afraid of the rise of China, so they have to beware of the Thucydides trap. even the Chinese premier has been starting to reference the Thucydides trap in speeches. So again, there is this idea, Thucydides becomes the all-purpose analogy. You can explain more or less anything with reference to Thucydides, provided you have this belief in his essential authority and in the idea that he has identified these universal political principles. In other words, basic assumption, the Melian dialogue really tells you all you need to know about world affairs. Now, of course, again, it's fairly easy to spot some problems with this approach. One of the obvious ones is that the Melian dialogue is not a statement of Thucydides' political theory. It's a dialogue between the Athenians and the Melians. Essentially, Thucydides is, he's using sock puppets, he's staging a debate. It's quite a leap of the imagination to conclude that Thucydides must be identifying with the Athenian statement of things. That what the Athenians say about the state of the world, the emphasis on power, the absence of justice, the irrelevance of hope and so forth, that this must be Thucydides' view. But that's how he is read. Mainly, it should be said, because most international relations theorists don't read the entire book. They read the Melian dialogue with a little introductory paragraph which explains how this is the first statement of realist political theory. If you start reading the rest of the book, you then notice that Thucydides has got different speeches which present different ideas. They can't all be ideas held by Thucydides because they are fundamentally contradictory. It's much easier to see how Thucydides is developing through the speeches an account of how those particular people viewed the world, not his own view of the world. And the thing is, one reason why these readers look to the speeches is because that's where you find something that looks like a political theory, because the rest of the work is mainly narrative. Insofar as Thucydides sort of leads us to expect that he's going to offer us sort of general principles of political wisdom, he really doesn't offer very many. He doesn't state his assumptions, he doesn't state his maxims or anything else. Another thing worth noting is how often the speeches are corrected or modified by subsequent events. In other words, if you just read the speeches, you're not going to see how often Thucydides himself questions the things that are said. And the Melian dialogue is, again, the case in point. Very, very shortly after, the Athenians make this absolute statement that they are powerful, therefore they can do what they like, this is the way of the world. They then decide they're going to invade Sicily, which is the catastrophic error which then, puts them on the path to defeat. It's easier to read this as saying, the Melian dialogue expresses, one might almost say, the pathology of the Athenians. It expresses their belief that they are all powerful and can do what they like. And this is then part of the explanation for how they make such a catastrophic error. How they then think that sending a major expedition off to Sicily is a good idea. It's not that the world is such that the great power of the Athenians will always win. On the contrary, Thucydides wants to show us how this Athenian hubris has developed, how they have got to the point of believing in a world without limits, and where it got them. In lots of ways, Thucydides offers not a set of reliable, predictable political principles. He rather offers a view of the world in which most political principles, most simplistic statements of this is the way the world is, are then shown to be wrong, if not downright dangerous. in lots of ways, I think Thucydides might well have liked Donald Rumsfeld's line about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Recurrent themes in his account are uncertainty, ignorance, the tendency for people to believe that they know more than they do know, the tendency for people to misunderstand their situation and to make decisions on an erroneous basis. It's, you would say, the polar opposite of the sort of mechanistic, reductionist political theory that he's often assumed to be promoting. So what can we make of Thucydides then? I mean, he's not a straightforward historian, he's not a straightforward political theorist. He really does go beyond conventional genres. There's a phrase which the French classicist Nicole Laureau produced. Thucydides is not a colleague. Now that was, in her case, she was trying to say to her classical colleagues that Thucydides is not actually one of them. But it applies more generally. He's not a modern historian. He's not a modern political theorist. He is something else. One way of trying to characterize it is what Thomas Hobbes does, to produce a sort of composite. Actually, Hobbes is a highly sophisticated reader of Thucydides. The introduction to his translation is still well worth reading as an interpretation of Thucydides. Hobbes has the line that he is the most politic historiographer, that he's both historian and political theorist. He's interested in developing general ideas about how human beings behave, but never at the expense of the detail. Hobbes says Thucydides develops his ideas through the detailed accounts of events, through the texture of things. If anything, it's about the experience of really seeing the events of the Peloponnesian War pass by as if you were there. The vicarious experience of being in the Athenian assembly, hearing different arguments, having to decide on what the best course of action is, and so forth. Other writers have offered slightly different perceptions. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, offers something you might term Thucydides the philosopher, or even Thucydides the moralist in a very Nietzschean sense. So for Nietzsche, Thucydides is above all the anti-Plato. He's the person who sees the world stripped of illusion, stripped of delusion, who offers basically an image of complexity, ambiguity, uncertainty, who is concerned with moral issues, and we could say the Melian dialogue clearly does raise vital moral issues about might and right, the role of justice, and so forth. But he does not offer a simple answer. He does not claim that might is always right, but he's realistic enough to recognise that justice has its limits, that we live in a world in which potentially the strong do have the power to do what they want. And this is a way you could read many other passages in Thucydides as well. Or even further, you could read him as offering a sort of a tragedy of the human condition. A recurrent image of what human beings are capable of doing to one another when the normal restraints of the international order break down, or indeed when the restraints of civic society break down. I mean, a passage I don't have time to talk about now, but another of the most powerful passages in Thucydides is his account of civil war at Corcyra. The sense of, a society falling apart, not just physically, but sort of intellectually and culturally as well. Which is, I suppose, a place we can end. I mean, the conclusion to the Melian episode. The Melians reject the Athenian ultimatum, the Athenians besiege them, and early in 415, things come to a head. And this is you'd almost say, banal conclusion, which Thucydides offers to the dialogue. The Melians were now under heavy siege, and there was also some treachery from within, so they surrendered to the Athenians, to be dealt with as they wished. The Athenians killed all the adult males they had taken, and enslaved the women and children. The place itself they occupied occupied with their own people, sending out 500 colonists at some later time. Ending. Milos doesn't appear again. Thucydides has made his point, and the ending is almost emphasising, well, that's it. The war moves on, there are plenty more atrocities to come. And that's certainly one way of reading Thucydides, as someone with a very strong sense of the relentless, constantly repeated tragedy of human beings' inability to keep peace with one another. So, another concluding reading of Thucydides, this one from W.H. Auden, writing at the beginning of the Second World War, looking back to Thucydides as someone who has already anticipated it, who has already seen that war is not going to come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll now have questions and discussion from the floor. I may take people in groups with a few questions, but let's see who has. Yes, Tom.
Yes, thanks. I really enjoyed that. Very good. What I wondered about is whether you could explain a bit more context. From my reading of Thucydides, I was impressed by, I think fairly early on in the book, he talks about the 700 years of Spartan sort of norms of behaviour in dealing with allies and enemies. Now, there's obviously, at that time, there was a really well developed, I assume, I may be wrong, but he sort of gives the impression there was a really well developed set of norms of behaviour between allies and enemies. And yet he doesn't spell them out, as a sort of constitution or a declaration or anything like that. So maybe those were all he sort of made the assumption that his readers of the time would know what they were. And of course nowadays we don't know what they were, but they obviously meant a lot. They were 700 years old. And maybe the Million Dialogues is one of those examples where those norms were thrown out the window, where a new world, the Athenians were presenting a new world. Maybe I may have got the reading completely wrong, but that was my impression when I sort of read it. So, is there anything in my thoughts about that? Is there anything that strikes you, or have I got it completely around the wrong way?
I'll just take a few, and then we'll come back to
I just want to come back to your question of posing Thucydides as suggesting that we, the world is unknown unknowns, that we can't know the world. Because I think it seems to me that actually Thucydides was attempting to document his part of the world, his times, and to know and understand them. And I think there's a current postmodern reading of Thucydides, including in international political theory, that is invoking Thucydides to say, well, we don't really understand the world. We can't really master the world in the old modernist sense. And Thucydides becomes, is nowadays invoked to justify the need for humanity to take its cue not from humanity, but to take its cue from nature and necessity.
a few hands. I'll just take Angus, then we'll come back, and then we'll go.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed that. I wonder what you think about the imaginative reconstruction of prehistory that Thucydides gives us in Book 1. So around his methodological statement that he will only deal with facts, and he seems to be distancing himself from Herodotus. There won't be any fable or stories from travellers, it will be real stuff. He then blithely seems to go into a completely logical, philosophical reconstruction of prehistory of which he had no knowledge. And says it must have been like this, society developed like this, and that got us to the current day. That's his own statement. I mean, we can be fairly sure that's Thucydides. Does that give us any insight into what he thought the human thing was.
Okay.
Come back.
Right, I'll do it briefly in reverse. So to start with, yes, the opening part of book 1, known as the archaeology. This is the one, I don't think this is completely pedantic. He does the reconstruction and then he has all the stuff about I'm doing everything completely critically and only according to evidence, etc. So a case could be made, a case has been made, that he applies different rules to his contemporary history compared with the earlier period. On the other hand, he does, you could do sort of a sympathetic reading of Thucydides, is that he does his best with the earlier material, but actually all he's got to work with is Homer and a few legends. So you get a sort of a rationalizing reading that say, King Minos, forget all the stuff about the Minotaur, but obviously he was the first person to have a sort of a sea empire. So you get a sort of rationalizing reading, which tries to chuck out the most unbelievable bits of Homer, but hang on to some sort of historical truth. Now there are limits to how far Thucydides can get, because he's not an archaeologist and so forth. There's also a case to be made that, and I think it's not completely incompatible with the first point, but I certainly think there's a lot in this, that he is setting up his history. The whole point about the reconstruction, partly it's saying why his subject matter is the greatest war ever. So he wants to disparage earlier wars as being less worthy of writing history about. But he also establishes themes to do with power and the expansion of naval power and so forth. So it's got a role in the development of his argument, or if not argument, then also of his world view, of his vision. But yes, it is deeply problematic. And various historians had problems with this. The great British historian of ancient Greece, George Grote, regarded, this is the bit he can't stand. The rest of Thucydides is pretty well perfect. This is just silly, more or less. But Thucydides is doing something which, he's trying to apply his critical methods to material which is simply, immune to it. But it's certainly problematic. Nature of some interstate relations. I did about 700 years, but you're absolutely right. There is a tradition of how states are supposed to behave towards one another, how disputes should be resolved, and so forth. Thucydides doesn't discuss these very directly, partly because he assumes his audience will know all about them. We do actually know quite a lot about them from other sources. So Herodotus gives us a bit more information. We have got inscriptions, we've got sort of various sort of later writings. So we do have a sense of how things were supposed to work, which can sort of supplement what we're given by Thucydides. The Melian dialogue is the absolute rejection of any of those traditional norms. Forget the gods, forget ideas of justice, forget any reference to the history of relations between the states. They're irrelevant. Whereas we do see in sort of earlier encounters, these sorts of things are brought forward. So, for example, when the Plataea, there's a sort of case when the people of Plataea are trying to make a case for why they sort of should not be all executed, in which they do then go into historical arguments about the nature of their relationship with various powers in the past. It's clear that that did matter, that that's one of the norms. Equally, references to Delphi, to the Oracle. But the thing is, Thucydides, actually, these norms are being abandoned from the very beginning. And it's not just, the Melian dialogue is the most extreme example, but actually, the Spartans themselves end up having misgivings about their own action. And the Spartans are notoriously the most pious of the Greeks. They do eventually decide that one of the reasons they suffered a terrible military disaster at Pylos was because actually they had made war and kind of bent the rules a bit and that they were in the wrong. So in fact, the whole of Thucydides' history shows that these norms were not fully operative. Most people pay some sort of lip service to them, but never obey them completely. I can't quite think of a way of tying that to the final point. I think I would absolutely agree. Thucydides is... He's not a nihilist. He does not believe that there is no prospect of understanding. I don't think he believes that full understanding is possible, but the basic aim of his work is to try to understand. There is a basic hope that if you follow his methods, if you are critical and trying to stand apart from the different sides, and really if you recognise the complexity of the world, then you can come to understand it. It tends to be an understanding which emphasises, things are messy and contingent, and kind of the best laid plans and mice and men go after glares and so forth. But most of Thucydides emphasises that, I don't want to say people are terrible at making decisions, but they do it anyway. So I think there is a hope, either that his readers might learn to sort of evaluate their own situation better and make better decisions. It's almost a lesson in political deliberation. Or even, I suggested in a paper once, there's a kind of almost political therapy that you can come to terms with the world through the intellectual effort of trying to understand it. So basically, yes. I don't think he abandons the idea of understanding, but I think he has no time at all for some simplistic reductionist explanations. It's always multi-layered. It's always both long-term structures and the character of states. It's very, very short-term contingencies, particular circumstances. It's the role of individuals, and it's the role of entire peoples. It's always multi-layered.
Thank you. There's a number of hands, so I'll take Para first, and then Kevin, and then
Okay, thanks for the lectures. Very, very interesting. Certainly the book, I thought some of the things that in reading the book about was very interesting from the standpoint, or very fascinating from the standpoint of the kind of debates they had. The million dialogue, but there were other debates as well. Even going to Sicily, there was this fascist brewing, which obviously is quite absent in today's world, if you like. Not many people actually debate properly and thoroughly the pros and cons of doing any activity. So I'm just wondering, because you touched quite a lot on how people today and over the last decades have used Thucydides to explain certain situations, whether or not any lessons have been drawn or discussed from the context of leaders and vision, if you like, because Thucydides obviously had a lot of time for Pericles, for instance, and was, went into some detail as to his own ability to inspire people and pull people behind him and do the things that needs to be done. Whether in today's circumstances, whether writings do talk about it and almost draw lessons. Or
Kevin?
Yeah, I was quite interested in your view that the meeting dialogue about it sort of lacks justice or morality, but I think there is a type of morality, a type of set of unspoken assumptions in there about the nature of Athens. And I can't remember the exact person whose mouth puts it in. I actually think it's a Spartan in one of the opening sections where he talks about the nature of Athens, particularly in the war against the Persians. And he seems to conjure up a sort of conservative Sparta against a very dynamic Athens. And there is this sort of dynamism which is more than just might, because after all Sparta is quite powerful. It makes the, when he's making the balance and the comparisons. And I wondered if that was is a particular ideology that he reflects, or whether he's reflecting a type of wider Athenian ideology. It's just that it isn't just pure might, I think. And I can see, for example, the appeal this would have to Americans in the Cold War period, because it makes Athens sound a little bit like a sort of more, civilized New York. It's very dynamic. These people are willing to abandon their city, go onto the sea. They are you know, all they have is actually themselves. They're not concerned about their property. You know, it is sort of the ultimate individualism, or the ultimate human, as against the more static Sparta. And I wondered if, again, this is something that Thucydides develops himself, or whether this reflects a wider set of assumptions. And in particular, whether this, for example, follows on in later work. In other words, whether he's reflecting, you know, how far he's actually creating a tradition. And perhaps maybe the way that this is then used later. You talked about the reception of this sort of idea. But I found it really quite a memorable way of expressing things. And I think Angus had talked about this in one of the previous sessions. Was that correct, Angus, or am I putting words into your mouth there? But you referred, I think, to Thucydides' sort of definitions of Athens, but I wondered, you know, about its significance.
Okay, I'll take Alan, then I'll come back and go ahead.
I thought it was a fantastic introduction, thank you. And what I was just so inspired and overwhelmed by Peloponnesian Wars, reading it. It's almost like being in a drama in the moment of it, the debates, the battles, the actually quite empirical accounts of numbers of ships and amounts of people being killed and everything, with the more abstract discussions. And I think in a way it's tricky, and I really enjoyed how you, Paul, demonstrated that different times he's been assessed and re-evaluated in different ways dependent on those current moments. And it seems to me that today what's popular is things like when the discussion of the fog of war and everything's relative, and there's truth is always the first casualty of war. But in a way, to understand him is to take the best of what he's represented in terms of an attempt to portray and represent accurately. But also there are elements, it's almost like Shakespeare a little bit, where he seems to speak to everyone across all times, and we come to him with our own things. And he's also a man from his time and not of it, it seems to me. He recognises that even in his own statements about himself, how he's very different to Herodotus, but also to anyone that comes for quite a long time after that. And I suppose the question is, though, that you think, well, I found myself thinking, it's tricky because you see all these debates about democracy, and you realise that around that kind of time as well, Socrates is there, and you have Athenian democracy almost, and although it's not for everyone, and yet you do see the barbarity of war, and you see those statements at the end of it. There's just that throwaway statement, they all get killed and enslaved, or people are beheaded and all of that. And I suppose, you know, what's exciting to me is how we can read him and see the humanism within it, and how the accurate attempt to portray history, but also understand it in our own times and take the best from it.
Thank you. Okay, in what order? I'll start in the middle. I think, yeah, the passage you're thinking of is when the Corinthians are trying to persuade the Spartans that they need to do something about Athens. And they precisely, they present this image of the Athenians, which is partly intended to say, well, this is why they are dangerous, this is why you've got to do something. And they present an image of the Spartans, which again is partly to say, you know, this is who you are, Spartans. You are slow, you are always too late, you fail to do anything. I mean, it's very much intended to push them into action. But it's drawing on a tradition. It's not something that's being invented. There's certainly, we can see kind of, the early elements of this sort of characterization of relatively conservative Sparta, relatively sort of dynamic, radical Athens, is already there in Herodotus. It's certainly a theme which recurs again and again in writings of the time of Thucydides and thereafter. It's a major theme in sort of Thucydides, and in various respects, and it's one of the points where Thucydides himself becomes quite conservative, small c, in political views, that he regards this tendency in Athens as dangerous. And he regards, in various respects, this is why Pericles is able to get the Athenians into war. And I mean, Thucydides is often read as a cheerleader for Pericles. I'm actually not sure. I think he admired Pericles in many respects, but actually regarded elements of, certainly of his decision-making, as dangerous. And that, Pericles sort of encourages the most radical elements in Athens. It's closely connected to ideas of democracy. I mean, this is certainly not less, I would say, in Thucydides, but certainly in later writers, so sort of Plato or Aristotle, or the various sort of anti-democratic writings we have sort of sometimes attributed to sort of Xenophon. The idea that, Sparta is good because it sticks to traditional values, democracy is always on the move, uncertain, changing their minds sort of about things, always dynamic. It's not really intended to be a positive portrayal. I mean, you could say precisely, Athens makes more wrong decisions in the war precisely because of the tendency towards over-ambition and always reaching to do something more dramatic and more exciting. Sparta basically sits in their Peloponnese and occasionally sends out small expeditions. I mean, you could say there are good strategic reasons for that, but it doesn't pursue the war actively. Where the Athenians are sort of rushing all over the place, sending expeditions, and that's then their downfall, that they decide that invading Sicily is a good idea. In terms of drawing lessons from the speeches, I mean, lots and lots of people have taken Thucydides at face value that his history has important things to teach. They've tried to do this. There's lots of disagreement about what sorts of lessons you can learn. One thing you can learn from is, of course, rhetorical technique. So there's a long tradition of studying the speeches of Thucydides in order to learn how to give speeches. I mean, the earliest translations of Thucydides in Europe were not of the entire work, they were of extracts of the speeches, because that's what people thought were most important. And there is a tradition of, I mean, it largely falls into disuse because the nature of political rhetoric changes. But there's certainly plenty of examples of politicians drawing on Thucydides, among others, in order to understand how you should speak. What we get in the later 20th century is not so much studying Thucydides as quoting Thucydides, or again, particularly in the United States, and particularly from the funeral oration, you take choice aphorisms as a way of basically saying, yay democracy, yay us. The funeral oration is full of little snippets which express how wonderful the speaker's state is. So those do get used a great deal. And finally, I suppose, the drama of the work, I mean, I suppose I would basically say yes, and I think this is why it has continued to be read and influential, is because, I would almost say, different readers can find different things in it. It is, you would say, a very open work, partly because it's big, partly because it's complicated, partly because it is extremely artful. I'm going to have to sort of paraphrase, because one of the comments of the sort of German early 20th century ancient historian called Edward Meyer sort of said was that simultaneously Thucydides is simply absent. You're presented with the drama of these events as if they're happening in front of you. It seems as if you're being left to make up your own mind about what's going on. You've got divided loyalties. You can see the case on both sides. You're caught up in the question of, will the Athenians actually, in the retreat from Syracuse, survive? While, of course, you know that they won't. And simultaneously, you're aware that Thucydides is orchestrating everything. I think, and comparisons with Shakespeare always feel dangerously overambitious, but actually I think there is something there that we can see Shakespeare and simultaneously be caught up in the drama and experience his characters as real characters and know that it's his genius that's putting all of this together. I mean, in a lot of ways, Thucydides reminds me of a very big, complicated novel. There are so many different ways of reading it, so many different ways of sort of thinking, well, what's going on? That is a major part of its power. And again, the way in which it is simultaneously, you know, of its time, it is an account of a war back in the 5th century BCE, that yet seems timeless. And I mean, reader after reader has sort of, you know, looked at this and thought, my God, you know, this is the present day. You know, you can read the Median Dialogue, particularly if it's translated in a certain way, and think, well, actually, you know, this is modern power politics. This is precisely the sort of, you know, the dangerous logic of powerful states. You can look at the account of the civil war in Corsair, and particularly the way that Thucydides talks about, you know, sort of the collapse of language, the extent to which, you know, meaning starts to mean, you know, meaning becomes partisan. So, you know, justice is no longer justice. Justice is doing something for your side by doing something, you know, doing down the other side or whatever. I mean, again, reader after reader has looked at this and thought, you know, my God, you know, this is the present. This is my own society. Thucydides has somehow anticipated it. And again, that's partly, I think you could say, he is discussing events which basically are universal. So, you know, war continues. And all wars are different, but all wars do have various things in common. You know, societies continue to fall apart. You know, holding a society together is always difficult. Thucydides kind of offers a template for understanding how holding society together is difficult and what happens when it fails. So it's a universal situation, but presented in this, you know, remarkable level of detail which makes it seem real.
Thucydides goes to great lengths to describe what happens to political entities. But these political entities are made up of individuals, and I think that's in the realist tradition there is this inherent tension between the structure of an international system or the dynamics between political entities and individual human agency, individual human behavior. And does he ever really resolve this tension? That would be my question.
Okay, Phil.
Endorse all the thanks that have been given to you, a very interesting speech and lecture. I want to push you a bit on your views on the interpretations, and then maybe it's just mine not following you on that point. But you start off with the interpretation as a historian, interpretation as political theorist, and I agreed with entirely your sentiments about reading history backwards into things and finding the present in Thucydides is extremely suspect. So what you said about the political theorist view and your critique of that, I was very sympathetic to. Were you making a distinction between him as an historian and him as the first modern historian? Because when you put up the quote about him saying, look, I wasn't there, so I've had to, you know, ad-lib a bit, but he did add the condition that I've done that as far as possible to correspond to the intent of the people who were there. But you seemed a bit dismissive about that. Were you dismissive about him as being rewritten as the first modern historian or as an historian? Because it does seem that his great power for me and his great contribution to humanity is that he did write the first history in the sense of describing events as being the product of what men do. I mean, the point in the Median Dialogue that, you know, I think is very good is the point where, or not good, but which I draw out to the extent where he says, don't rely, you millions, on God, because God isn't here to help you. This is a series of events which is going to be determined by man, and we just happen to have more men than you do in this situation. So in terms of his contribution was reflecting that whole culture in Athens of rationalizing and seeing that it's men, not gods, that change things. That does seem to qualify him, to me, as the first historian. So were you being a bit dismissive of that or not? Or be helpful?
I'll take Sean, and then we'll come back now with one final last question. Sean.
The whole thing seems to me to sort of be like a letter to future Athenians written by a good Athenian who just thinks the Athenians have been idiots over and over again. And there is a few asides. If I tell me, you tell me there isn't, then fine, I'll believe you. But I thought I read several kind of asides all the way through. There's one near the end where he talks about democracy. And he says, among the things he says is, if you're going to do democracy, it's much better you do it for everyone. Well, he says, don't do democracy, it's a disaster. But if you do it, make sure everyone is involved in it. And it seemed that was the kind of a lesson all the way through. When he describes it, yet another stupid thing that the Athenians did. There's many of them over and over and over. It's like he's trying to tell them, look, we had it in our power to make a decision a better way. It's not so much the fact that they made the wrong decision, it's the way that they managed to make the wrong decision. Why did you get Alcibiades to say that? Why did anybody listen to him anyway? There's lots of things he doesn't say. You really wish he did say it and describe in a little bit more detail about how they actually come about. But is it fair to say that it is a bit like his objectivity, as far as it goes, is as definitely as a lesson, as a good Athenian, to tell the other Athenians that they're idiots and that they must, reconsider how they would be Athenian in the future.
Okay, I mean, again, well, I'll start with that one, and I suppose, Thucydides was an Athenian. He has a certain tendency, he knows slightly more about Athens. He has a certain tendency to take things for granted there. On the other hand, he was an Athenian with interests outside Athens, with plenty of connections, and of course was sent into exile by the Athenians, so spent much of the war outside Athens. Now, of course, incidentally, that's been another of the claims as to why he's the perfect historian, that despite being wronged by the Athenians, he doesn't therefore turn back and condemn them, and he's equally not seen to be pro-Athenian either. I suppose personally, I don't find that Athenians are clearly the audience. I think Greeks are the audience. I think yes, Thucydides was even more ambitious than that, but basically he's interested in talking to Greeks. Or rather, he's not just interested in talking to Athenians, it's kind of the obvious broader audience is Greeks. Now certainly he is concerned with terrible decision-making in Athens, and with the reasons for that. I mean, one of his things is precisely, why is it that people make bad decisions? How far is it because they are misled by clever speakers? How far is it that they just have a ridiculous level of optimism about, sort of possibilities? I mean, he has, very small passing comments about those sorts of things. Even more, at this point, it starts looking terribly, terribly complex and postmodern and clever. You get one of the most tricky speakers is the politician Cleon, who's kind of, signalled all around, this person is a brilliant speaker who's, misleads the Athenians. He is the person who develops the cogent analysis of why political speakers are dangerous and why the people allow themselves to be misled. So it's always a bit like the Cretan liar paradox. Do you believe this clever speaker telling you why clever speech is politically dangerous? So he's interested in that, but again, I don't think it's solely Athenian focused. I mean, he's not, he shows why the Spartans make terrible decisions. He shows what's going on all over the place. I mean, it's, it is a work concerned with the Greeks as a whole. Specifically on democracy, I mean, again, he doesn't say very much in his own voice about Athens. Mostly, if he does say something, it looks anti-democratic. So he praises Pericles, or at least he seems to be praising Pericles, because the line is something like, what was in name a democracy was actually the rule of the one man. And that looks like, praise for, well, it's certainly not praise for democracy. Then, at the end of the book, when there is an oligarchic coup, at one point, the citizenship in Athens is reduced to 5,000. So in other words, a whole load of people who had been citizens are disenfranchised. Thucydides does make a comment to the effect that actually this was as best governed as Athens ever was. So he's more likely to be read as someone who's not that keen on Athenian democracy, or at least wants to see it limited. But, as I say, I think his concern is more broadly sort of political deliberation and decision-making wherever it might be found. That sort of connects to the first question about, relating to political entities and individuals. I have to say, I think that's one reason, again, why this sort of crude tradition in American IR likes the Melian dialogue, because you don't have to worry about it. You've got the Athenians apparently acting as a single entity. Now, you could think through, well, obviously these are Athenian ambassadors, it's not the whole of Athens, but it's much more straightforward. Whereas in other debates, and the debate about whether Athens should send an expedition to Sicily or not is quite a good example. What Thucydides is interested in is precisely the interplay between the persuasive speakers for different sides, the role of their supporters, and the way in which the mass of the citizenry then divide up, having heard the arguments. Now, that doesn't really get discussed very much by the IR people, precisely because it kind of doesn't fit so easily, or you have to sort of shoehorn it into this general principle of fear, honour, and interest, and then decide that this is sort of okay. The Athenians are making a decision on this basis, and almost ignore the fact that Thucydides shows that they were actually divided and there are different perspectives. So I mean, Thucydides tries to link these different levels. Now, whether he wholly succeeds is another question, and there is a question of how do we sort of connect up some of his general statements about why the war happens, which I know few and far between and right at the beginning, with then his detailed narrative of what actually does happen, which places much more emphasis on kind of contingency, the role of particular speakers, and so forth. So certainly he's got a more sophisticated view of state decision-making than sort of crude IR realism. Final one, yes, Thucydides was a historian, but that's an incredibly vague term. I personally wouldn't claim he was the first historian. I think actually Herodotus has got a decent claim to being the first historian. Thucydides, in some respects, is a continuity of Herodotus. In other respects, he's doing something rather different. He very self-consciously says Herodotus is a load of rubbish, read me. He uses a different term for what he's doing. He doesn't use the term historie. So he wants to set himself up as something new. I suppose certainly I would dissent from the view of espousing the view that Thucydides is the modern critical, history as science person, because to hold that view you have to ignore enormous amounts of Thucydides. You have to try and pretend that the speeches aren't there. On the other hand, he is something more than the typical ancient historian. I mean, he really does stand out from pretty well all the other Greek and Roman historians in terms of what he's doing and what he says he's doing and how he does it. I suppose I quite like, I'm putting my cards on the table, I like thinking of Thucydides as a historian, I suppose as a historian of the future, or as a potential historian of the future, because I think precisely he offers this model of critical scrutiny, of the emphasis is on trying to understand rather than just accepting any old story. But there are two, all of that sort of fits more or less happily with sort of modern historiography. The two aspects of Thucydides that don't quite fit are actually ones which I think history needs more of. The first is the purpose. I mean, it is not studying the past for the sake of studying the past, it's studying the past for the sake of the present and the future. So his idea of why history matters and what we could learn from it is much more powerful than a kind of conventional historicist approach. And secondly, the artfulness of it. The fact that, it shows, history is not just a sort of, set out the facts, call a spade thing. I mean, most modern historiography, certainly a lot of modern historiography, tries to pretend that it's not also a literary art. Like Thucydides makes it very clear that it can't be anything but a literary art, but it's art in the service of history rather than art for art's sake, if that makes sort of sense as a distinction. So he uses all his literary skill in order to achieve his historical ends. So in that respect, this is quite different from a sort of, you know, history for history's sake, which sort of since the mid-19th century has been, you know, the dominant assumption of the discipline.
We'll just take any final quick points, and then we'll chat.
Yeah, I really like that idea, because one of the things that really struck me when you were talking about it is that the idea of dialogue and speeches in writing is very of the time. It's a very Greek thing. In a lot of Greek writing, you had that dialogue where big issues were being discussed through dialogue, not necessarily because you believe that that was the dialogue that was being had at the time. And the thing that I like about him in terms of how you would like to look at history today is the fact that he does pose those big issues. He's writing in a very uncertain time. They don't know how to form some kind of state. And in a way, it's almost saying, you know, is it right for the Athenians to use mines? Would that be done right? Or actually, if these people do oppose him and say, we're not going to count out, what will happen? Because nobody really in Athens knows what will happen. And it strikes me that he's kind of moved towards, you know, dislike for democracy is kind of what a lot of historians want to do. Is that kind of, let's have something very definite that this is what history is, this is how it is, and that, you know, when we talk about international relations theory, you know, this is what history is, this is what is always going to happen. And he is so of his time that he cannot say that because it is so uncertain. And that's why I would like to be able to see his approach used more today. Because you can't look back on it and use it to project on now unless you understand exactly what he was doing, which was actually questioning everything that was going on, because there was no certainty for him to what was going on.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention you talking about the Thucydides trap and how people have related it to the USA currently fearing China's rise. I just wanted to ask a clarification. Would the trap be that this is history repeating itself and it's going to happen, or is the trap that it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that if we're understanding, if we take what Thucydides said, that war was inevitable because Sparta feared the rise of Athens, that it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy because the USA is fearing China, so therefore war is inevitable. So is the trap that it is going to happen, or that it could happen just because we think it's going to happen? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you want to answer those, I need to conclude them after.
Okay, it's kind of neither of those. I think the fear is it could happen if we don't act to stop it. So kind of, this is the case is being made that, you know, those of us who've read Thucydides will see that this could happen, so we must leap in and write op-ed pieces about Thucydides, you know, to make sure it doesn't happen. I think in terms of, you know, it's, well, put strongly, it would be that it is inevitable that this will happen unless people recognise the problem and pull back, or at least that it is likely it will happen.
Yeah.
Unless people pull back. That, you know, kind of all other things being equal, established superpower faced with rising superpower is not likely to end well, would be the crude argument. Going back to the question then about sort of dialogue and debate. I mean, yes, you know, one of the arguments as to why Thucydides uses speeches and dialogues and so forth is that, you know, that's the nature of Greek culture at this time. You know, politics is all about deliberation in the public assembly. Athens is all about, you know, sort of the sort of staged debates in Attic tragedy. Philosophy uses dialogic form and so forth. So, you know, in some respects, he's, you know, kind of he's reflecting his time. But I do think it's more than this, which is what you sort of suggested. I mean, it's the extent to which, well, again, I'd be tempted to say it emphasises complexity. It emphasises the fact that actually there are several sides. And we are being faced with, you know, arguments from both sides and having to make up our own minds. And at this point, I suppose, I would possibly slightly risky endeavour, but I would kind of set up Thucydides against Plato, but my feeling of Platonic dialogues is they are heading in a very specific direction. We know who's right, we have Socrates who is right, and we have various people who have to be sort of, have to be explained to them. I think Thucydides dialogues and Thucydides pairs of speeches are much more open in the sense of it's not clear that one is right and one is wrong. In most cases, actually, there is right and wrong on both sides. One classic example is the Mytilene debate, the pair of speeches where the Athenians are trying to decide would it be a good idea to go and massacre the population of a city that briefly tried to rebel against us. I mean, arguably, the two speakers are both wrong, or at least the arguments that one speaker uses to say, let's not massacre them. And in a sense, that's the side that ought to win, but the arguments used to win it ought to make us very, very disturbed, because it is, again, no reference to justice, it's entirely a sort of, instrumentalist, pragmatic argument. In some respects, the arguments of the speaker who says, we've said we're going to massacre them, we ought to massacre them, are, you'd say, more convincing as arguments, even while we don't feel comfortable about what is being argued for. We are put in a position of, we're sort of, sitting there in the Athenian assembly, being sort of faced with, two lots of incredibly clever, convincing arguments. You listen to one speaker, you're persuaded. You listen to the next speaker, you're persuaded. What do you do? I think I'd actually say the intended effect of the text is to leave the reader sort of thinking, oh my God, where do we go? Right. This time I really should stop talking, but just to finish, with the Melian dialogue, in some ways I'd say similarly. I think it's fairly obvious that we are sympathetic to the Melians rather than to the Athenians. I don't think we're supposed to sympathise with the Athenians. It's slightly scary that there are people who read this and think they should sympathise with the Athenians. But I think we're supposed to read it and feel very uncomfortable about our difficulty in answering the arguments of the Athenians without having recourse to precisely the things that they are expounding. How do you answer the sort of, the argument, oh, right, you've got hope, that's a fine thing, that's kind of, the last resort of those people who are actually completely stuffed but don't want to admit it. And, the Athenians have got some alarmingly persuasive arguments. So again, I think, it's not that there is a clear right or wrong. The main aim is we read this, and partly we're getting a sense of, well, I suppose, yes, quite what an appalling place the Athenians have got themselves into in their attitude, but also a sense of, how do you actually answer those kind of might is right arguments without having to have recourse to the kind of illusions that they've already disparaged. So, I think it is open. It is about sort of getting us to think rather than telling us the answer. And in terms of concluding remarks, I think that's probably the one I would offer. Thucydides wants to open up problems and get us to think about them, and to look at events and think, well, why did it happen like this? Could it have happened differently? What can I then learn from that? He does not offer an answer, he doesn't offer political principles, he doesn't tell us what the future is going to be like. If anything, it's a training in how to think about the world, or I think that's what it's intended to be.